Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. In the various discussions I've been involved with about defining atheism as a lack of belief, I've sort of taken the psychological origin of it for granted. Let's set aside for a moment whether anyone actually uses the word according to this definition. And let's also set aside that Anthony Flew first proposed this definition in 1972 as, basically, an explicit rhetorical trick. Despite those things, defining atheism as a lack of belief in God does answer a psychological need, which many people who self-identify as atheists have. For the benefit of any atheists who are listening, I will note that the word many does not mean the same thing as the word all. For clarity within this video, I will refer to this subset of atheists as lackers. I think the best way of seeing what psychological need this definition fulfills is to look at the etymology the lackers always cite. It is, so they will tell us, formed by taking the prefix a to denote negation and attaching it to the word theism. Thus they are not theists. But this begs for the question, what does the word theist mean? I think they'll generally say it denotes a belief in God or gods. But right there we run into a problem. Those two things are utterly unlike each other. A necessary, uncreated creator who made all that is, and a big guy with a hammer who can throw thunderbolts have nothing in common. The only positive quality we can all agree that they both have is that at least a few people believe that they exist. The same is true of gerbils and global warming. And what about titans? What about nymphs or cyclopses, giants, trolls? I saw an atheist call mermaids gods. What these things actually have in common is that materialists don't believe in them. I've got a feeling I need to pause at this point and explain what a materialist is. Unfortunately, materialism is not easy to precisely define, for reasons which I'll go into later, but loosely it's the belief that only matter, energy, and physical forces exist. Roughly, you can summarize it as, all accurate descriptions of reality are applied physics. The term was common enough in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but its unfortunate confusion with a moral taunt made it fall out of vogue. But since Madonna was a material girl in a material world, nobody criticizes buying too much stuff as materialism anymore, so that unfortunate verbal confusion is irrelevant, and the term materialism is much needed to clarify conversation these days. So to get back to the unfortunate term theism, its real definition as the lackers use it is, basically, the belief in anything other than what a materialist believes in. This is where the practical problem with defining atheism as atheism comes from, because if you substitute the definition of theism, an atheist is someone who is not a materialist. In theory, the double negative doesn't cancel out, and this is not the same thing as just saying materialist. The problem with honesty comes in where the lackers defend this distinction if anybody else talks about atheism, but then collapse it themselves anytime they talk about atheism. Less precisely, they use the term atheist to mean materialist, but complain vociferously anytime anybody else does. This brings up the question of why it is that lackers don't want to say that they're materialists. I don't mean why they don't use the word, but why they insist on the double negative. Well, let's look at materialism a little closer. The word materialism originated from the idea that only things made of matter exist, but this was complicated by the discovery of massless objects like the photon. The world we live in is much stranger than the atheists in the 1800s thought, and materialism has been bent out of shape with subsequent discoveries. In fact, materialists of the 1800s would probably consider modern theories that what we call matter is just a concentration in field strength superstitious spiritualism. Well, they wailed about the Big Bang too. Atheists have historically had a habit of disliking real science in preference to their fairy tale versions of it. Kind of like the fundamentalists they resemble so much. But I digress. The reason I brought this up is that in its modern form, materialism is very difficult to give a real definition for. Mostly, everyone just operates on the 19th century superstition, which originated from a very poor understanding of the physical world, without even trying to update it to our modern understanding. To make this concrete, suppose that there was a being called Zeus, who existed as the concentrations in a field we don't know about and who, because of this field's interactions with the electrical fields we are familiar with, could cause the simultaneous migration of massive quantities of electrons. Would he be supernatural? He wouldn't be bound by the same sort of body that we are, and he could do things that we can't. What would a materialist make of it? If Zeus existed in this sense, a modern materialist could believe in him. In the 1800s, they certainly didn't believe in neutrinos or gamma rays or gravity waves, so we have a great deal of experience with turning out to be wrong about how limited the universe is. Yet none of them ask this sort of question, and if you even propose it, they would scoff. They've had to adapt their explanations slightly to the discovery of a whole collection of things in the natural world unimagined by the men of the 1800s, but in the main, they maintain the same intuitions and prejudices, especially that they could explain anything that ever happened, if they bothered to look into it. Also that they already know basically everything there is to know, so the only sorts of creatures that could exist are variants on the animals they already know, hence why mermaids, which, if they existed, would just be an odd case of convergent evolution, are somehow lumped in with the supernatural. I still don't know where the existence of giant squids leaves the kraken. The practical result is that I'm going to talk about materialism in terms of what it meant back around, say, 1880. It's clearer and at the same time probably more accurate, despite some minor adaptations to what science has learned in the interim. In this version, basically it amounts to everything that exists being made of atoms, which bounce around in a sort of 3D pool game, with gravity pulling everything together and chemical reactions acting like billiard cues, occasionally breaking them apart again. If you simply knew where all the atoms were and what their momentum was, you could predict arbitrarily far into the future where they would be. It's all nice and neat and makes everything very easy to understand. As a theory of everything, it's got a lot to recommend it. The only real problem is that it's impossible to prove. Far too much actually happens in the world to prove what is responsible for all of it. Or, in fact, for almost any of it. In a lowly ant, there are more atoms than a person can count in a lifetime, and if you tried using experimental apparatus to somehow make sure that they were all acting according to your theory of cosmic billiards, the ant would rapidly cease to do anything ant-like. But in the 1800s, this was a minor problem, and materialists were generally content to just take materialism on faith since they couldn't prove it. More recently, I think people started pointing out to materialists that if they were going to take something on faith, they should do it with something better than materialism. It's not that Pascal's wager is a great argument, just that materialism is about the worst bet that you could possibly place. If you're willing to take it seriously as a basis for living, I mean. Ironically, materialists of the late 1800s said it was scurrilous to suggest that materialism would lead to a change in morality, when they weren't calling for those sorts of changes themselves, that is. It's very odd how people raised with limits but claiming, as adults, the license to do anything they want, can't imagine that people raised with that license will act differently than they did. But I digress again. Anyway, there really is no answer to this challenge, and for reasons I'm unclear about, the people who say that reason is merely an apparently successful survival strategy and not something which leads to truth seem to think that they do need to reply. Maybe it's because faith became a dirty word for them, or maybe it's because courage is a disappearing virtue, but I suspect there's more to it. But whatever the problem, they're hard of their shoes. They feel that no answer means that they lose. So they do the only thing which they possibly can. They say, well, can you prove that materialism is false? I wonder if they learned that trick from the fundamentalists, or the other way around. Anyhow, it would sound very dumb if they actually, literally, said that. So instead they take advantage of the fact that everyone believes that matter exists. Well, almost everyone. And instead say, we all agree that matter exists. Can you prove that anything else does? It's still a very, very weak position, since they're basically claiming that they haven't progressed past the understanding of a 3-year-old child, but at least they don't have to use the F word. Faith, I mean. The problem is that this doesn't do what they think it does. They're trying to recover materialism without having to take it on faith, but the whole point of materialism is to make the world easily intelligible. If in fact, as they claim, matter is the only thing which they know exists, given any particular phenomenon in the real world, they can only claim a material explanation for it if they can give a complete explanation of the phenomenon in terms of matter, and then prove that this is how the phenomenon actually happened. And given that the world is so complex we can't actually look into its inner workings as it works, good luck measuring the electrical charges of every electron in a running cheetah, in every part of its stride, that means that all they can say is that they don't know how anything works. But the whole reason that materialism was attractive in the first place is that by eliminating all other possible explanations, even though no particular material explanation could be proven, some material explanation had to be true, because there were no other possibilities. Moreover, because matter was so limited in what it could do, there weren't that many possible material explanations, and so mere plausibility became fairly convincing. But if someone merely knows no more than matter, the possible explanations for a phenomenon are literally limitless. So when the lacquer tries to talk as if materialism is true, he is, according to him, in the position of a 6-year-old explaining the world in terms of the few things he knows. It's really cute when 6-year-olds do this, because their deductions are very logical and very wrong. They're wrong precisely because there's so very much which the 6-year-old doesn't know. Usually at this point, any sort of conversation with the lacquer will go in one of two directions. One is getting lost in the weeds of how it's necessary to assume things it isn't actually necessary to assume. I'm not sure why faith is a dirty word to them, but assume is just fine. Especially since they tend to misunderstand what faith means and believe it means assume. The other direction such conversations will typically go is factually false claims about how people normally operate, like, you assume that things don't exist unless someone proves them to you. Then, once the conversation has gotten sufficiently derailed, they'll accuse you of not understanding what they said, and I think this isn't a rhetorical trick. They've never really thought their position through. I'm fairly confident that the extremely common argument patterns one sees have been evolved, not designed. And as much as anything, they're trying to express an emotional reality. They're certain that matter is the only thing that exists, and they're equally certain that they can't prove it. Those two things they do know. The emotional part is that they feel that this is okay. Or rather, that they are. Not that they're perfect, just that they're still valid human beings who shouldn't be rejected from the tribe, cast out into the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. For a great many people, this is the central fact of their lives, that they are not unworthy of their tribe. They don't really care whether things are true or false, nearly so much as whether it makes them worthy or unworthy, that is, accepted or rejected. I've seen this manifest as people claiming that two obviously contradictory beliefs are not contradictory, because they themselves hold both of them. The key to understanding this is that they're not speaking to the truth claims, but to the psychological possibility. They do this, and are not cast out, and therefore it can be done, and not cause one to be cast out. And very relevant to the emotional reality of lack of belief atheism is that there are many lackers, at least on the internet, and that when they get together they form a group which is accepting of this behavior. They're not in the emotional position of seeking validation. They're in the emotional position of having it. And I think this is why they repeat, like an answering machine message, "You don't get it," when people point out that what they're saying isn't true or is self-contradictory. In a sense, they're right. We don't get it. They're not making truth claims. They're just telling us how they act. You can debate a truth claim, but you can't debate how someone acts. The only thing you can do with how someone acts is to condemn them for it, or not. And they've already got people who don't. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.